So just a little bit about Amber to introduce her. Amber is a lawyer working in Fredericton, New Brunswick as the Associate Director of Public Legal Education and Information Service of New Brunswick. And if I've got the pronunciation right, I think it's referred to as Please NB, which is a nonprofit organization that informs New Brunswickers about the law, their legal rights and obligations. Amber has worked with Please NB since 2018, and in 2020 stepped into the role of director, managing many of Please projects, including oversight of their written publications and Safer Places NB, a major project working to develop workshops and practical resources on sexual harassment in the workplace, funded by the Department of Justice Canada. Amber's hobbies include community theater, painting, and complaining about Twitter culture to her many pets. Amber will present an overview of the Safer Places NB project on addressing and preventing sexual harassment in the workplace. She will give an overview of the progress made with the project to date, including how Please gathered necessary information to inform their approach, the tools and resources currently available through Safer Places NB, and where the project is headed next.
Hi, so as introduced, my name is Amber Chisholm. I work with Public Legal Education and Information Service of New Brunswick. I hope that there will be lots of time for questions, so feel free to drop them in the Q&A. There are folks who are monitoring that to pass along questions for me. So I'm here today to talk about Safer Places NB, which is a project we've been working on for about 4 years now at Please NB. I'd like to start off first with a land acknowledgement, which I understand the folks at Respectful Workplace Week have already done at the beginning of each of the day's presentations. But Please NB would like to respectfully acknowledge that we're located on the unceded territory of the Wolastoqiyik, the Mi'kmaq, and the Pescatomakati peoples. This territory is covered by the Peace and Friendship Treaties of 1725, which did not include the surrender of land and resources, but instead recognized Wolastoqiyik, Mi'kmaq, and Pescatomakati title and established the rules for what was to be an ongoing relationship between the nations. So as a quick introduction, if you'll just bear with me, I don't have my notes slide showing. I'm so sorry, I feel so disorganized today. Just bear with me if you don't mind. Do you all have my presenter view now, or is it just sharing my slideshow?
I can just see your slideshow now very
Wonderful.
Clearly.
Okay, so I'm going to jump in with an introduction now of the project. So Safer Places NB, I'm Associate Director at Public Legal Education. I've been working on this project since the very beginning, through the initial grant application to the delivery of tools and the resources that are available through the project. So we're a nonprofit charitable organization. We promote access to justice by developing plain language, bilingual educational information resources and services about the law. And on this project, we partnered with the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission, which was established in 1967 by the Human Rights Act of New Brunswick. The commission provides citizens with an effective way to address complaints of discrimination, educates the public about this process, and maintains ongoing awareness of the effects of inequality and the fundamental nature of diversity and inclusivity. So Please NB and the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission have partnered on this 5-year project spanning from 2019 to 2024 on addressing and preventing workplace sexual harassment. And this project is funded by Justice Canada. Although the tools and resources developed as part of this project are meant to aid all employers and employees in New Brunswick, this project does have a particular focus on vulnerable peoples, including in particular the LGBTQ2S+ community and population. This focus is premised on research confirming that current sexual harassment legislation, policies, and remedies typically use gender binary terms and concepts. So for example, they're often framed in he and she terms or him and her terms, where there is a male aggressor and a female complainant, for example. While yet we know that the LGBTQ2S+ community is more vulnerable to harassment by and large. This restrictive approach to education can sometimes lead to limited definitions of sexual harassment, and it relegates LGBTQ2S+ people and others to the margins of that conversation about sexual harassment. So existing protections and remedies do not necessarily offer the same security to all people. As an overview, this is going to be a 55-minute session. I'm hoping there will be time for questions. I'm going to start by giving an overview of our consultation phase in year 1. And then I will give a quick overview of the tools and resources that you can currently find available through the project. And then I'll move on to the consultation phase 2, which we just completed in the spring and early summer of 2022, following into what we plan to do next based on that second round of consultation and research. The objectives of this project, to be stated generally, are specifically related to respect members of the LGBTQ community to this point. They're meant to increase knowledge and competency amongst the legal community, employers, and individuals to address and prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, and particularly against members of the LGBT community. This will include creating specialized training workshops for legal professionals and employers, as well as a transferable set of metrics with which to measure a workplace's reporting procedures. The second objective would be to address barriers for members of the LGBT community and others when seeking legal information regarding workplace sexual harassment by creating, printing, and disseminating educational materials. This includes identifying related sexual violence issues that may impact on the experience of sexual harassment among vulnerable people. The third objective that we identified is to create multiple points of access for individuals to obtain legal information or summary advice regarding sexual harassment, including exploring ways to refer and connect people with trained professionals who can offer specialized advice on their situation. So the project's rationale basically is that our most common understanding of workplace sexual harassment is conduct such as making passes with a coworker, soliciting sexual favors from someone, questions about their sexual activity, unwelcome touching, and dynamics that are often portrayed as a male supervisor making unwelcome advances on a female employee. Research findings show that women are most likely to experience sexual harassment, while other vulnerable populations, such as the LGBTQ2S+ community, are also at risk of being harassed in the workplace and elsewhere. Some individuals are doubly disadvantaged. For example, when victimization is based on gender identity or gender expression, it often overlaps with other forms of marginalization, such as race or disability, their age, their social condition, immigration status, for example. This project recognizes that intersectionality and addressing harassment in a holistic and collaborative way. And we have a commitment to making sure that everybody working on this project has received trauma-informed training as well. So 60% of workers reported having experienced workplace sexual harassment of a non-sexual nature, and we have that information in our consultation report along with citations. And 94% of the people reporting workplace sexual harassment were women. 47% of the LGBTQ community report having experienced a form of workplace harassment based on their sexual orientation, and 90% of transgender and gender variant members had experienced workplace sexual harassment. So we know that this was a problem that needed addressing, and we did see a gap in the educational resources and literature that were specific to this community. So the first phase of this project was to conduct public consultations to better understand the barriers that vulnerable groups experience when confronted with workplace sexual harassment. To that end, we engaged consultants to help us gain valuable insights from members of the LGBTQ2S+ community and others, such as employers, employees, academics, unions, researchers, and other community groups. And you can get a copy of our consultation report and what we found from those public consultations on our SaferPlacesNB.ca website. The findings of those consultations, we learned quite a few things. We found that there were quite a few barriers and challenges presented by many current responses to complaints of sexual harassment in the workplace. Issues such as power dynamics and not knowing if somebody would be believed in the workplace or if they were making a complaint against somebody who had more structural power than them in the workplace. Fear of bias on behalf of the people they were making the complaint to. Cultures in the workplace where there may be a culture of tolerance for certain kinds of behavior and not a general agreement and consensus on what is and is not acceptable in the workplace. There were also worries about things like lack of confidentiality when somebody makes a complaint and not knowing if everybody else in the workplace would find out about it. A worry that people wouldn't get updates about their complaint once they made it, not knowing what stage the complaint had reached, if the person that was engaging in the harassing behavior had been informed or not. Complainants sometimes talked about not knowing where they were in the process, and that being in and of itself kind of upsetting and a form of re-traumatization sometimes. And we also heard information about the reporting processes sometimes being unclear or inaccessible, it not being written down anywhere clear, or maybe there was a policy that said you could submit a complaint, but it didn't say what that complaint should look like or what would happen when you made that complaint. So you were kind of going in without any information about what the process looked like. So this is an overview of some of the information that we received from our public consultations, where we asked people what kinds of barriers or issues they were seeing when navigating uncomfortable situations in the workplace, situations of sexual harassment or toxic work environments. So again, the current issues that we noted before, according to the participants, notwithstanding the legal requirements that many organizations still do not have harassment policies according to the workplace safety standards in New Brunswick, where those policies did exist, they were often binary and complicated, unclear, or leading to mismanaged complaints. So the one issue that we identified in particular was a sense that the target of the harassment or the person experiencing the harassing or toxic work environment felt that they had a lack of autonomy or there was poor communication on behalf of their workplace. So several participants expressed a concern with respect to a target's lack of control over the complaint process or a lack of communication they receive once their allegations had been raised. And this can feel very isolating. One person says, once you report it, you have no control over what happened. I was being harassed and I told my manager. There was a period where post-complaint, they took a couple of days or weeks to figure out the situation and how serious it was. And that time period was awkward, uncomfortable, and stressful. I had no idea if they had even told the harasser, and I had to work beside that person daily. The other issue that we identified involved ongoing working relationships. So some participants raised a concern with respect to the ongoing working relationship between the harasser and the target post-complaint, which can be both intimidating and isolating, but also uncomfortable if they wish to continue working with that person and only wished to address the behavior or the inappropriate comments or conduct. It was noted that sometimes separating the people can have a similar isolating effect, for example. So our recommendations coming out of these consultations involved looking at training. So we wanted to identify the options for training didn't involve simply educating people about recognizing sexual harassment. We wanted to make sure that our training included information for employers and people making decisions about these issues, information for managers who may be witnessing behavior in real time or receiving complaints in real time, as well as information for bystanders who might be witnessing an uncomfortable situation but not know what to do, and then for employees who may themselves be experiencing an uncomfortable situation, unwelcome comments or conduct in the workplace. We found that particular emphasis should be placed on the sexualized and sexist behavior that sometimes happen in the workplace. So again, we wanted to move away from a perception that sexual harassment is mainly about sexual desire or a solicitation of sexual favors or making sexual comments to a person. It can also include things like questions couched in curiosity about a person's sexual partners or their genitalia or their body. purposeful misuse of their pronouns, and many other things that are not just the overt and binary examples of a harassment like a catcall or physical touching. Sexual harassment can involve things that have absolutely nothing to do with a person's sexual desire, but rather an inappropriate case of curiosity or comments about a person's sex life or body. We also looked at options for supporting targets specifically and addressing the needs that they themselves identified, such as bystander training, resources for helping a person through a complaint. So through that, what we did and what you can find on the Safer Places NB website are a couple of template documents. We have a template workplace harassment policy that employers can download and basically fill in the blanks to use as a sample policy in their own workplace. We have a template communication protocol and flow chart for employers to use when they're in a situation where they've received a complaint and don't really know what to do next in terms of investigation or asking the right questions. We also created a template complaint form that employees who work in a workplace that have unavailable or no workplace harassment policy, they can just download our sample complaint form and use that because it complies with the workplace safety laws in New Brunswick. Oh, sorry about that. So the tools and resources that are available now, I've given a brief overview of some of those. The SaferPlacesNB.ca website is going to be the hub for most of the information that you can find to date on related to this project. You'll find on that website a sexual harassment FAQ with some really commonly asked questions that we heard throughout our consultations, as well as questions that we receive at Please NB through our work as a general information service. So we included a lot of questions that we got about misconceptions about sexual harassment, what may or may not qualify, or what a person can do about it. You can also access our training through the website. So we have training modules for employers and a training module for employees. These two modules are available in two formats. So we have a facilitated version where a person can sign up or a workplace can request a session for a facilitated workshop with one of our staff or contracted partners or a legal professional to come and give our workshop and give an overview of the law around sexual harassment, some sample scenarios and sample conversations on navigating a situation that may or may not be sexual harassment, as well as information on what the law says you can do about it, as well as options outside of the law that may go over and above the bare minimum legal standard, but help promote a positive conversation and hopefully positive outcomes. The facilitated training for employers is about 3 hours long, and the facilitated training for employees is about an hour and a half. The main difference between the two is that the session for employers includes quite a bit more information about the law, the legal obligations, and an appropriate investigation, whereas the training for employees is basically the first half of the training for employers that includes an overview of how to recognize sexual harassment, what the legal standard is, what some poorly recognized forms of sexual harassment can be, as well as some ways that you can go about addressing it, whether you're comfortable doing it within the workplace, want to go elsewhere, such as the Human Rights Commission, or explore perhaps mediated options or other conflict resolution options. These two sessions or these two modules are also available in an online format, which means that you can go in through our portal on the website and access an online version where, for example, some discussion questions have been recreated into a video example or some multiple choice questionnaires. And they are a little bit shorter than the facilitated sessions, and a person can take it on their own time, which means that instead of blocking off an hour and a half or 3 hours, you can do it in 15-minute increments, and the module will save your progress. And you'll still receive a completion certificate at the end, just as though you had taken the facilitated training. So we tried to make those options available in multiple formats to accommodate as many people as possible. We understand that it isn't always easy for people to take time off during their workday to take a training module, for example, because often that time is also unpaid. You'll also find other resources and materials. We have a handout for bystanders, for example. I've got an overview here of some of our resources and handouts. So we created a sample glossary on terms relating to the LGBT community specifically, because we found in our consultations that that was something that came up really often, is that people received really unwelcome comments and questions based on their sexual orientation or gender identity, simply because a person was curious and thought that their coworker would be a good source of that information. And those questions aren't always welcome in the workplace, especially if they are related to a person's intimate relationships, sexual partners, or body. So we've got a glossary that will hopefully help to inform some people who might be curious about certain terms or pieces of information, but who maybe are learning that going to individual people and coworkers in the workplace is not always the best place to get that information. We have a handout explaining microaggressions and how to identify them and why they're a problem. A handout for bystanders who might be witnessing an uncomfortable situation and don't really know what to do about it or what the right thing to do would be. Tips for employees experiencing harassment, and again, a template harassment policy, a template complaint form, and some checklists and guidelines for handling a complaint when an employer witnesses or receives a complaint of sexual harassment. And the next few slides I have here are just going to be some examples of those materials and what you'll find when you go to the website. So here, for example, the glossary starts, we've got some really simple ones here, LGBT, like in the acronym. We had these definitions proofread by subject matter experts and members of the LGBT community. One thing that I always say when talking about these definitions, and I'm not going to get into the definitions, this is simply an example to show you what you might find on the website, but it's really important, and I always say this when talking about definitions when it comes to identity and orientation, that these definitions are descriptive and not prescriptive. And by that we mean these are terms that people use to describe their experience to others in terms that are hopefully easy to use or have some kind of common understanding. And it is a way to describe a person's experience of the world. They are not prescriptive in that they are not hard boundaries and hard definitions that we can use to say whether somebody is or is not a thing. We don't use these definitions, for example, to tell a person whether they technically qualify as gay or transgender. These terms are tools for people to use to describe their own experiences and not rules for people to use to set boundaries around other people's experiences. I hope that makes sense. Again, this is just a sample from our template on our handout on microaggressions. This is kind of a Cole's notes of it. Research on sexual harassment in the workplace shows that in addition to old-fashioned and blatantly sexually explicit behaviors, vulnerable individuals such as members of the LGBTQ2S community may also experience more subtle forms of harassment, and these are referred to as microaggressions. These are brief but commonplace indignities directed at people from a vulnerable group, women, LGBT community members of racialized minorities, Black and Indigenous people. And this can include things like stereotypes about people based on their race or gender identity. It can include exclusively promoting heteronormative behaviors and talking in the workplace, assuming everybody has a heterosexual partner. Ostracizing or ignoring women or LGBT people in the workplace, or stigmatizing with small comments like slights and insults that are underhanded. And again, this presentation includes some links to our template forms. You can find them on our website, but if this presentation is disseminated afterwards, you can access this as some quick links to our template complaint form, our template workplace policy, and our checklist and guidelines for employers when they receive a workplace sexual harassment complaint. I'm going to move on next to the recent developments that we've had for this project. So for year 3 and beyond, we're just into year 2 now, or year 4, sorry, now, and we've just completed year 3. So we did during this last round of consultations, what we called sector-specific consultations. We identified certain sectors within the province that we identified as potentially requiring more information about sexual harassment and how to address it. So this focused on expanding our scope to address sexual harassment in industries we identified as either male-dominated or highly service-oriented. We theorized that there would be gaps in these industries with regards to sexual harassment and how it can be prevented. Again, from our perspective of educating the public, that sexual harassment is not always motivated by sexual desire. We held public consultations where we invited members of these industries. So here on the page, we've identified trades and constructions, service and hospitality, which includes hotels, restaurants, and retail, as well as environmental professions such as fisheries and forestries. We held these public consultations and invited members of these industries, employees, and employer sessions were held separately. And our consultation experts also spent some time in the public, for example, physically going to the mall in St. John to speak with people about their experiences and thoughts on the subject, to hear what people were saying if they were willing to speak with us. Our findings following these conversations with these specific sectors identified some issues we expected and some we didn't. So one that came up frequently were absent policies. So our workplace doesn't have a sexual harassment policy, or I've never heard of any sexual harassment policy in our workplace. Or I know that our workplace has a policy, but there's no enforcement of it. A complaint doesn't go anywhere, or there's no obvious place to send the complaint. We also heard that there was a need to expand our training materials to include more information about gender stereotypes, assumptions about what certain people can or cannot do based on their gender identity, whether they be a trans person, a woman, a man in the workplace. And we also heard that people wanted practical solutions for the issues that they run into in the workplace. And a suggestion that we are moving forward with, hopefully, involves sample conversations. So, for example, we heard from people working in retail and hospitality that sometimes the harassment is coming from a patron or a customer. And it can be very difficult to know what to do in that situation when you're working in a work environment where you're supposed to defer to the customer, or you want to get that sale, you want the customer to feel welcome and safe, you want to get your tips, or you want your boss to feel that you're doing a good job. So if a person is behaving inappropriately toward you when you're working in that environment, it can be really difficult to know how to set those boundaries. So people said that they would find it beneficial to have a sample conversation where we have a scenario where a coworker is making an inappropriate comment to another coworker, or a customer is making inappropriate or unwelcome comments to an employee, and how a positive conversation might look in a situation like that. So people wanted information specifically about how to deal with the public in uncomfortable situations like that. We also heard that a leadership-focused approach would be necessary going forward if the goal was to change minds and change the culture around sexual harassment in the workplace. People felt that the messaging would be better received if it was coming from managers and employers themselves, and if managers and employers are well informed about sexual harassment, rather than perhaps engaging in a culture of acceptance or a culture of downplaying certain behaviors as harassment, it's more likely to be adopted as a standard in the workplace. If people don't feel that their managers are on board, or if they feel their managers are telling them to suck it up, then that workplace is never really is going to have a much harder time establishing a higher standard in terms of workplace conduct. So what's next for our Safer Places NB project? We've identified these consultation findings and some of the issues that came up specifically. So going forward, we're going to update our training modules. We're moving away from a focus on the legal tests and criteria that will still be included in the training, but we will spend less time talking about the legal standard and put more focus on the practical solutions. So we heard from participants in male-dominated industries that a culture shift around workplace sexual harassment is needed. Participants feel that there needs to be a demonstrative buy-in from the top. So we're expanding the employer training program specifically to include a leadership component, a module that focuses on the importance of frequent and proper messaging, modeling of appropriate behavior, supporting employees and having difficult conversation with peers or clients, and condemning damaging behaviors commonly found in certain industries or in the workplace. This module would be targeted at those at the supervisory or management level, so those in a perceived hierarchical power, as opposed to people like human resources professionals who may not necessarily be perceived as setting the standard in the workplace, or who may already be informed about some of these standards. We'll also be adding, again, a difficult conversation modules to our employee training to address the issue presented in the consultations of employees not knowing how to engage with members of the public or coworkers who are making inappropriate comments or advances. This module will coach employees on how they might respond to these situations and how they might seek management support if necessary. We intend to accompany this module with video or audio clips so that employees can practice these responses within the workshop. We're also working on developing what we're calling a guided pathway. So I've been calling this a kind of interactive flowchart. It will be on the website, hopefully launching this fall, and it will be programmed right onto a page on the website. The idea is to give people a walkthrough of the various options to address sexual harassment in the workplace. So this will include things like informal workplace options, what to do within the workplace or having a difficult conversation. It will include a walkthrough of the Human Rights Commission complaint process, the Canadian Human Rights Commission complaint process, the standards for a complaint with Workplace New Brunswick, what a civil litigation or a lawsuit based on sexual harassment might look like, as well as criminal options and when and how a person might be able to go to the police about a certain incident of sexual harassment. This guided pathway will basically start by giving people an overview of these options and when they might apply, and a person can click on one of those options, and then it will bring them to step one of the guided pathway. So step one, for example, in the human rights complaint process would be to contact the commission and get a copy of their complaint form. And from there, the guided pathway will basically give people a walkthrough of what to expect throughout that process, when a complaint might be able to be dismissed by the governing body, when a person might be able to explore other options, what those options might actually look to them, when a person can refuse, or when a person can ask for other remedies. The idea behind this is to give people informed options ahead of time so that they know what they're getting into. We heard from a lot of people that when they're experiencing a difficult situation in the workplace, one of the more stressful aspects of that is not knowing what to expect and not knowing what will happen, and not even knowing if your complaint meets the standard of what somebody would consider workplace sexual harassment. So this guided pathway is kind of trying to give people a snapshot of what the whole process might look like ahead of time. So they know what to expect. They go in knowing when their complaint could go one way or another. They know what their options might be in terms of looking for other options. And they also know what the whole process looks like from beginning to end. So we're trying to cover as many of the publicly available options as possible to give people a good overview of what that might look like and what to expect. And they can explore as many of those options as they want through the guided pathway. We are also next working on a legal advice component through a lawyer referral service. So New Brunswick has never had an established lawyer referral service of any kind. There's never been a service you can call or contact and ask to be given access to a specific lawyer or access to time with a lawyer outside of the legal aid framework or certain volunteer-run walk-in clinics. This service will basically be operated through online and telephone options to connect people for general information from PLACENB staff about sexual harassment. And then those who contact this service and who identify themselves as experiencing harassment or a toxic work environment, they're given the option to be referred to a lawyer for up to 2 hours of summary advice. This can include advice about a person's particular situation and their options, perhaps information about what their best option might be or their best couple of options might be, as well as help filling out things like complaint forms or court forms. So this will be done through the support of the New Brunswick Law Society, we're looking for a roster of lawyers who will get on board with this project and receive our training and our trauma-informed training. And from that list of lawyers, we'll be able to connect people with lawyers in their area. We'll hopefully be able to give people a couple of names so that they'll have their choice of lawyer in their area to meet with. And then the lawyers working on the project will bill the project rather than the individual. So this is really a project aimed at getting people quick information and advice they need from a lawyer without putting them in a position of having to pay out of pocket to get that advice. So I've got a page here with some additional resources. We've got our SaferPlacesNB project, as well as the Please NB website. Generally, we have lots of information about many areas of law there, where you can get information about domestic violence, small claims court, family law, those kinds of things. We've got links here to the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission website, as well as their policy guideline on sexual harassment. It's quite a large document with quite a bit of information about what the Human Rights Commission considers when engaging with a complaint of sexual harassment, what the legal standards are, as well as some information about complaints and how they have been handled in the past. As well, here we've got a link to the WorkSafe NB website, because they operate under legislation that requires all employees in the province, or all employers in the province, to have a workplace harassment policy, and that includes sexual harassment. So the legal standard at the moment is that all employers in the province have a workplace sexual harassment policy, but we know from working on this project that that's not always the case in practice. So WorkSafe NB can provide people with information about what their standard is, and our sample policy meets those standards and can be used kind of on a print-off basis for employers who don't have the resources to develop one themselves. So that concludes my overview. It looks like there's about 15 minutes left on my time, so that's lots of time for a Q&A if folks have questions waiting.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Amber. And I really appreciate learning about the tool on a much deeper level. And I myself look forward to sharing information about the project within my networks. I see the benefit for employees and employers. So thank you for that. I see that we do have a couple of questions already. So just a reminder, I invite you to go right to the Q&A for your questions, and we'll start there. So the first question, Amber, is how do you address sexual harassment when discriminatory jokes or attitudes are part of the culture at your workplace, when it is everywhere?
Yeah, and that's a really difficult question for people to navigate in real time when they don't have any legal background or conflict management training. It's one of the things that came up the most in our consultations, was that, like, I know what makes me uncomfortable, or I know what I feel is inappropriate in the workplace, but the other people in my workplace don't agree. And the other people in my workplace tell me that this isn't a big deal and I'm just too sensitive. That can be really difficult to manage, especially if management is also on board with that attitude. So there are a couple of ways that you can go about addressing situations like that. And you really have many of these options available. There's no sense of having to scale it in any way. You don't have to start at the least conflict, like the most conflict averse option, and then wait to step up the ladder. You have many options available to you. One of them would include, if you feel that you have management or HR that are more on board with what the standards are and what is appropriate, you can go speak to them about the behavior that you're experiencing in the workplace and why you feel that it's inappropriate. If you're not comfortable with that, or if you don't feel that management or HR is fully informed with why this feels inappropriate or isn't welcome, you can go directly to the New Brunswick Human Rights Commission, because sexual harassment is defined pretty widely. And as I talked about in this presentation, it's not necessarily motivated by sexual desire. It can be any unwelcome comment or conduct of a sexual nature. And that includes things like your gender identity, the clothes you wear, what your body looks like, even if it's not salacious in nature. And it also includes what they call a toxic workplace environment. So you don't have to be the target of specific comments or questions to be experiencing a toxic workplace environment. Examples of cases that have gone through human rights commissions in Canada include, workplaces where it was normal to have inappropriate sexist calendars up in people's workplaces, or to circulate sexist or homophobic jokes by email for the workplace to laugh at. Even if you're not a person who's identified as the butt of those jokes, you're still a person working in that workplace where sexual harassment is normalized and accepted. And that still does fall under the standard of sexual harassment. So the Human Rights Commission would be another option, and they can and will investigate complaints like that and offer things like mediation. So those things don't always go straight to a tribunal. There are options to sit down with the Human Rights Commission mediators and actually talk about this and what can be done about it.
Thank you. The next question we have is, if we know that many workplaces don't have policies that they need to have legally, what explains that gap? And then the further question is it just awareness? And who is responsible for fixing that?
Great question. So I don't have data to show exactly why there is that gap. I have two theories about why there's a gap. I think one of it is awareness. I think this law about the sexual harassment policy is quite recent. It was passed in New Brunswick in, I believe, 2017. Previously, workplaces were required to have a harassment policy, but the legislation was amended fairly recently to say, and that includes sexual harassment. So employers might not all be informed about that. They might not be, keeping track of legal updates like this, and there isn't necessarily a newsletter being sent out to all employers about this. So it's possible they're not informed. It's possible there's no desire to do it in some places. They just couldn't be bothered. There's also a possibility that they may know that it's a requirement and want to comply, but feel they don't have the resources to do it themselves. We're a small province with a lot of smaller employers, and it's very possible that somebody just doesn't feel like they have the legal or the HR knowledge internally to develop a policy like that. So one of those rationales is something that we identified as something we could address through the sample template policy. So hopefully employers start accessing that, and WorkSafeNB themselves also have a template policy that you can access. So if you don't like ours or don't like the way it looks, you can go to the WorkSafeNB one as well and download it. But again, awareness is important. So people who want a policy but don't have the resources to make one might not necessarily know that these templates exist. So spreading the word is important. There was a last portion to that question, and I'm sorry I've missed it.
So the last question, so it says, is it just awareness, and who is responsible for fixing that?
Yes. So there is no one identified enforcement body that is proactively going in and checking to see if workplaces have these policies. If it comes up throughout a separate WorkSafe investigation, they will tell an employer that they need this policy. But the way to address it, if you're aware of a workplace that requires a policy and does not have one, you can call WorkSafe New Brunswick yourself and anonymously tell them. So if you're an employee, they will not tell anybody who they received that information from. You just call and anonymously say, XYZ employer isn't complying with the legislation in terms of having an effective policy in place. And WorkSafeNB will go in and tell them, you have until such a date to implement a policy. And if you can't do it yourself, here's our template. So WorkSafe will go in, and you don't have to be an employee at that workplace. Again, it's an anonymous option, so anybody can call WorkSafe and tell them that they know that this is an issue.
Okay. Et la prochaine question. Qu'est-ce qui distingue le harcèlement?
The next question, what's distinguishing sexual harassment versus the other types of harassment in workspace at the level of victim effects of the victim? Are you saying that sexual harassment is different from the other types of harassment? Oh, yes. Well, it's hard because I think that sexual harassment, for many people, they're thinking that it's hard to define. A lot of sexual harassment forms are questions asked in a curious, from a curious motive. A lot of people that are that are experiencing this don't know that they can make a complaint on this harassment issue. And there's also an aspect of I don't know what the French name, the humiliation, indignity. Some people feel that the questions and the comments on their bodies and their sexual orientation and their relationships with other people are not appropriate, but they do not know how to address it at the workplace because they feel like they need to be that we all have to be friends and we have to be friendly. So there's two ways that this could be a problem. Number one, it's hard to identify sexual harassment for sometimes for the person, but sometimes even if we can identify it, we don't always know how to address it because the others are not always, um, you know, they don't necessarily always know what's happening. Maybe because this question is not a very comfortable question. So there's not always consensus that this is not an appropriate behavior and that it is indeed harassment. So we spoke earlier about isolation, and this is certainly sexual harassment. So isolation, the idea that there's no support when we're victims of sexual harassment, and also another one, the feeling that it's accepted and that it's not really a problem. I'm simply too sensitive.
Merci, Amber.
Thank you, Amber.
And here we have someone that's sharing a workplace experience and asking for some advice. There is a person close to me who works in fast food. This person is quite young. A manager does things like sneak up behind and put ice cubes down their shirt, etc. Other coworkers ask about this person's gender, etc., and argues about their identity with them. This is a very public space, and the youth is afraid of losing their job and unsure how to proceed. And they're asking if you have any advice to share.
Yeah, and this sounds like a really difficult situation. I will preface with my lawyerly disclaimer, which is that I cannot give legal advice in a format like this. I'm not permitted to give specific advice about anybody's particular situation and what they should do, but I can tell you about the legal standard and the options. And I can tell you that comments about a person's gender, unwelcome speculation about a person's body or gender identity, as well as unwelcome touching of any kind, which would absolutely include putting things down a person's clothing, are all things that the Human Rights Commission would identify as sexual harassment and as inappropriate conduct in the workplace. And what I'm hearing in part of this story is that it's not just that the conduct itself is humiliating and isolating, it's that this person is fearing for their job and their economic well-being if they do anything about it. And that's a really common theme in situations of workplace harassment generally. People feel like even if I knew what to do about this, what if I just lose my job? There are no really good solutions to that feeling in practice. Like there is always going to be the risk of somebody being bad faith or being retaliatory. But I can tell you that according to the law, retaliation based on a complaint of sexual harassment or harassment of any kind, or discrimination of any kind is prohibited by the law. And what that means in practice is that, for example, if this young person did go talk to the Human Rights Commission about what's going on, or decided to file a complaint about what was going on with WorkSafe or with the Human Rights Commission, there is a separate ground of complaint if there's any retaliation whatsoever. And retaliation is not just defined as somebody losing their job. It can be defined as somebody losing hours, as somebody getting the cold shoulder at work and being treated in a discriminatory way simply because they've talked to the Human Rights Commission or submitted a complaint. So it can include all kinds of things. Retaliation is defined broadly. And if that does happen, it is a separate ground of complaint under the Human Rights Act. So it basically would open a whole new complaint. But that's a reactive measure and not a proactive measure, obviously. So this person does have some options available to them. There's the legal standard in terms of the Human Rights Commission or getting some legal advice. There are other options that are more informal, that involve maybe talking about training in the workplace, giving some educational resources or posting some educational resources on the workplace bulletin board, or asking to have a mediated conversation with higher up management and the staff involved. I do realize that that can be really intimidating, and that in practice, a person might not be comfortable doing that. So if they feel that they need support in doing that, they can reach out to places like the Human Rights Commission, which always offer mediation as one of the first steps after their investigation process.
And we just have 1 minute, and I'm wondering if you might answer one quick question.
Sure.
In a situation similar to the one currently that was described in the scenario that someone shared, could someone launch a complaint on someone else's behalf?
Not usually, not legally speaking. So with the Human Rights Commission, or with a complaint on a legal, like with a legal body such as a court or a tribunal, usually in order to have what we call standing, a person needs to be the subject of the complaint. So sometimes in cases of workplace sexual harassment, that can be defined broadly. A toxic workplace environment is something that everybody experiences. So it's definitely worth contacting the Human Rights Commission staff for advice about a situation they're experiencing. In cases where one person is being specifically targeted with harassment, it can be difficult to argue that a third party can go in and submit a complaint on their behalf. But if you're in a workplace where this kind of conduct and commentary is acceptable, you could look into the option of filing complaint on your own behalf on the premise that you're experiencing a toxic workplace environment yourself. But very rarely can you file a human rights complaint on somebody's behalf. Really, the only times we see that happening are parents filing complaints on behalf of their minor children who are being discriminated on based on a disability or something like that.
Okay. And it's about time for us to finish up. I just want to mention that definitely there's been some thanks and appreciation shown in the Q&A and the chat. And on behalf of the Workplace Violence and Abuse Research Team, I mean, Amber, we're very grateful for your presentation and sharing of this information today. So much so that someone is asking if you could share the resource page.
Absolutely.
I don't know if that's something you can drop into the chat.
I will just go back one if I can.
Sure.
If I can, previous there. I'll give you a few seconds to finish writing that down.
So thank you. And just as a reminder to folks, there will be an opportunity to provide feedback at the end of today. So if you're able to stay or come back and join us later, feedback is welcome for future planning for Respectful Workplace Week. And please take a few minutes to stretch, bio breaks, and our next presenter will be starting on the hour at 11 a.m. and we will have Lise Laforge joining us. Thanks so much, Amber.
Thank you.
Bye for now.
Bye.